All right, so today we're going to dive into something really fascinating. It's a breakdown of what's said to be a top-secret strategic memorandum, but from a fictional near-future scenario. And it outlines this pretty radical plan for one global power to stop a nuclear war between two other countries, all without ever firing a single shot. And that's really the big question here, right? How do you actually pull that off? It sounds like the plot of a movie, but this document treats it like an incredibly urgent, real-world puzzle that needs solving, and fast. So let's see the wild answer this memo comes up with. Okay, so let's get into it. First, to really get why the proposed solution is so out there, you have to understand the crisis. And the document, it paints a pretty chilling picture, a world that is right on the edge of what it calls the third atomic bombing in all of human history. So the memo itself is dated March 9th, 2026, and it lays out this terrifyingly fast-moving timeline. A joint U.S.-Israeli campaign has hit Iran hard, but it hasn't stopped the fighting. Now, Israel feels like its very survival is on the line, and it's about to trigger its Samson option, which is basically a last-ditch nuclear strike. The author is screaming that the clock is literally ticking toward nuclear midnight. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. The memo gives this incredibly bleak assessment of the traditional global powers. It says the United States, well, it's a part of the fight, so it can't be an impartial referee. Russia is tied up with its own problems, and Japan, in the author's view, has kind of abandoned its historical mission. All of this together creates a massive and very dangerous power vacuum. So you might be asking yourself, okay, why would China even get involved in a fight happening so far away? Well, according to this memo, it has absolutely no choice. This distant war actually poses a direct existential threat to China's very survival as a nation. And the entire logic of this whole grand strategy, it's all grounded in one single, absolutely critical number. Over half, 54% of China's crude oil comes directly from the Middle East. If that supply gets disrupted, especially by, radioactive contamination, it would be a complete catastrophe for China's economy and its social stability. And look, the author is not pulling any punches here. They call a potential shutdown of the Persian Gulf a direct and fatal blow to the existence of our state. So from this point of view, a nuclear war over there isn't just some regional problem. It's a direct attack on China itself. So with an existential threat on the table and a power vacuum on the world stage, what do? Well, the memo unveils this new, bold, grand strategy, and it has a pretty epic name, the Roar of the Wise. It's a doctrine designed not to win a war, but to prevent one from ever starting by just redefining the rules of the game. So this is the crucial point, right? This whole doctrine isn't about moving troops or sending warships. It's a strategy of communication. It's about making a public statement that is so powerful, so undeniable, that it completely changes how every other country thinks about the situation. And here it is, the red line. The memo proposes that China goes public and declares that any use of nuclear weapons in the Middle East will be seen as a direct nuclear attack on its own core interests, and that it would trigger, quote, immediate devastating retaliation. Think about what that means. A nuke going off in the Persian Gulf is the same as a nuke going off over Beijing. And this is why the author believes the threat is so credible. It's all based on a massive, lopsided difference in military power. As the memo points out, Israel's best long-range missiles can't even reach China's key cities. China's ICBMs, on the other hand, they can hit literally any target on the planet. So the threat of retaliation, it's not a bluff. It's a one-sided checkmate. Now, this is where the strategy gets really, really clever. It's not just about making a big, scary threat. It's about using that threat to make another superpower do your bidding for you. The memo actually brings up the classic Chinese principle of Tai Chi. In martial arts, Tai Chi is all about using your opponent's own force and momentum against them. Well, this document basically says, let's do that with geopolitics. Let's put the United States in a box where the only way for it to protect itself is to accidentally do exactly what we want. And this slide, it just lays out the trap perfectly. China's declaration forces the U.S. into this impossible choice. Option A, you back your ally, Israel, let them use nukes, and risk New York or LA getting vaporized in a nuclear war with China. Or option B, you do everything in your power, everything, even physically stopping your ally, to prevent that war from ever happening. So the memo argues this move basically turns the United States into what it calls an execution unit for China's foreign policy. China just draws the line in the sand. The U.S. immediately realizes its own survival is on the line, so it becomes the one to step in and enforce the no-nukes rule in the Middle East. It's brilliant in a way. So let's say this incredibly bold plan actually works. What's the endgame? Well, the memo sees this as way bigger than just stopping one war. It imagines a fundamental shift in the entire global power structure. The memo predicts this whole cascade of effects. Countries in the global south, who also need stability in the Middle East, would quietly get behind China. Any military moves by the U.S. and Asia would suddenly look reckless while China is busy preventing a nuclear apocalypse. And ultimately, the document claims, China would emerge as the world's new, responsible major power. And to bring it all home, the author wraps it up by quoting the master of strategy himself, Sun Tzu. The roar of the wise is presented as the absolute pinnacle of statecraft, achieving a total victory, saving the world from nuclear war, and reshaping global politics, all without a single person having to fight. So this memorandum gives us one fictional but really powerfully argued answer to that question. It suggests a nation can just declare a place halfway across the planet essential to its existence, and then back that up with a threat nobody can ignore. It really leaves you wondering, as our world keeps changing, what other new lines are going to be drawn, and who's going to be brave enough to draw them?
Welcome to this deep dive. If you are joining us today, you are stepping into a very rare, highly exclusive look at the hidden mechanics of global geopolitical strategy.
Yeah, it really reads like the script of a tense political thriller.
It totally does, but it is entirely grounded in the very real, very terrifying tensions of our current global landscape. Today, we are taking a look at a highly classified theoretical memorandum titled Strategic Memorandum on Preventing Nuclear War in the Middle East and Defending Our Country's Core Interests.
And the origin of this source material is just as intense as that title implies. It's dated today, actually.
Right, March 9, 2026.
Exactly. And it was submitted by a special research fellow operating out of the Chinese People's Liberation Army National University of Defense Technology.
The PLA.
Yes. The author uses the pseudonym Doctrine 77, presenting themselves as an independent strategic advisor.
So the mission of our deep dive today is to carefully unpack this author's proposed strategy, which they've named the Roar of the Wise Doctrine.
It's quite a name.
It is. It's this radical, comprehensive blueprint detailing how China could theoretically step in to prevent a nuclear disaster in the Middle East and, in the process, completely restructure global power dynamics.
Without firing a single shot.
Exactly. All without firing a shot. Before we go any further into the mechanics of this doctrine, though, we do have a critical piece of housekeeping.
Right, the disclaimer.
Yes, this source contains highly politically charged views regarding the Middle East, the United States, Israel, Iran, and Japan. We want to state unequivocally to you, the listener, that we are not taking sides here.
No, not at all.
Nor are we endorsing any of the viewpoints, military theories, or geopolitical claims presented in this document.
Our job here is strictly to impartially report and analyze the strategic arguments just as they are laid out by the author. We are just the messengers, decoding the military and political theory for you.
Okay, let's unpack this. According to the memo, the Middle East is essentially sitting at what the author calls nuclear midnight.
Yeah, they paint a picture of a world on the absolute brink. And this was triggered by events that began just over a week ago, on February 28th, 2026.
Right. The document details a series of massive joint U.S. and Israeli air and missile strikes that heavily damaged Iran's underground Natanz nuclear facility.
And the author notes that these strikes severely degraded Iran's capabilities, reducing their ballistic missile launch capacity by nearly 90%.
Which sounds like a lot.
It is a lot, but that still leaves them with an estimated 100 to 200 units.
And that's the strategic problem the author identifies. That 90% reduction was not a knockout blow.
No, because despite that massive loss of launch capacity, the memo states Iran is continuing daily, multiple missile and drone attacks.
And this relentless retaliation is pushing Israel toward an existential crisis. The author claims that the conditions are rapidly aligning for Israel to invoke its ultimate nuclear doctrine, universally known as the Samson option.
The Samson option is a really foundational concept to understand here.
Yeah, could you break that down?
Sure. It refers to a theoretical strategy of massive last resort nuclear retaliation if Israel's survival as a state is fundamentally threatened.
And the author argues that U.S.-led missile defense systems are failing to prevent this scenario, right?
Exactly. The memo makes a specific controversial claim about U.S. missile defense, arguing that the maneuverability of these incoming warheads is actually overwhelming systems like Taiwan and Patriot.
Which are systems designed to prevent exactly this kind of saturation attack.
Right, yet the author claims they are leaving critical Israeli infrastructure, such as vital desalination plants, completely exposed.
What's fascinating here is the author's analysis of the global response to this ticking clock. They describe a world paralyzed by a historical vacuum in global deterrence.
Yes. The author argues that the United States has lost all objective deterrence capability because it is a direct party to the conflict. It can't act as a neutral arbiter anymore.
And Russia.
Russia is described as completely tied down by its resource commitments on the European front, leaving Moscow without the capacity or political capital to intervene effectively.
The memo also takes very sharp aim at Japan's role, or I guess lack thereof, in this crisis. It specifically calls out the current Japanese administration, the Takaichi administration.
Accusing them of abandoning a profound moral duty.
Right. The author's argument is that Japan, as the only nation to have ever suffered a nuclear attack in war, should be leading the international charge against nuclear use.
Instead, the memo claims Japan has opted for subservience to U.S. foreign policy and escaped into the dangerous illusion of nuclear sharing.
Which brings us to the ultimate conclusion the author draws from this total paralysis. With the U.S. compromised, Russia distracted, and Japan supposedly abdicating its historical mission, there is a total vacuum in global deterrence.
And the core argument driving this entire memorandum is that only one nation possesses both the capability and the strategic imperative to fill this vacuum.
To halt the march toward nuclear war.
Yes, the People's Republic of China.
The reasoning behind China's proposed intervention is incredibly pragmatic, though. The memo makes it explicitly clear this is not a doctrine born out of pure altruism.
Or some sort of global peacekeeping ideal.
Exactly. It is a cold, hard calculation of national interests. It all comes down to the economic lifeline of the Chinese nation. The numbers provided in the text are just stark.
China relies on the Middle East for over 54% of its crude oil imports.
54%. And the author breaks that down further, noting that 14% comes from Saudi Arabia and 11% from Iran.
To put that into perspective for you, imagine the largest manufacturing economy on the planet suddenly having more than half of its energy supply vaporize overnight.
The memo states that if the Middle East becomes a radioactive battlefield and critical arteries like the Persian Gulf or the Strait of Hormuz become inoperable due to contamination,
it would be a fatal blow to China's economy.
The author equates the loss of this oil not just to an economic recession, but to a threat against China's very existence as a functioning state.
And that economic reality is then paired with a concept the author calls China's asymmetric geographic security.
This is where we get into the cold military calculus of the doctrine.
Right. The memo points out that Israel's longest-range ballistic missile, the Jericho-3, has an officially estimated range of about 4,800 to 6,500 kilometers.
This is a critical data point because it means the Jericho-3 cannot physically reach China's major political and economic centers, like Beijing or Shanghai.
And the memo casually dismisses any unconfirmed reports of longer-range Israeli missiles as mere information war bluffs.
The other side of that geographic equation is China's arsenal. China's intercontinental ballistic missiles, their ICBMs, possess the capability to assuredly destroy any target on Earth.
The author depicts China as the only nuclear-armed state in this specific scenario that can threaten massive retaliation to stop a nuclear launch without carrying any real risk of having its own homeland struck in return.
It's an overwhelming positional advantage.
It really is. It allows China to act as the ultimate guarantor of peace, simply because they are geographically insulated from the immediate counterstrike.
Taking a step back, though, this aggressive interventionist posture seems to completely contradict China's long-standing nuclear policy.
You mean their no-first-use policy?
Right. China has a very famous, very public no-first-use policy. They have historically pledged not to be the first to use nuclear weapons in a conflict and explicitly not to use them against non-nuclear states.
Threatening to launch a devastating nuclear strike against a nation thousands of miles away sounds exactly like a first use.
The jurisprudential maneuvering the author uses to bypass this contradiction is incredibly complex.
And arguably the most transferable lesson of this entire document. The author constructs this massive legal loophole.
First, they classify Israel as a de facto nuclear weapons state.
Right, by defining Israel this way, the author immediately removes them from the protections granted to non-nuclear states under China's historical policy.
That handles the non-nuclear state provision, but it still leaves the no first use hurdle. How does the author justify firing first in defense of the Middle East?
The memo redefines the very concept of an attack on sovereign territory.
The author proposes that China must officially declare that any radioactive contamination of the Middle East, which would sever China's vital oil supply, constitutes a direct, fatal attack on China's core national interests.
Therefore, if a nation uses a nuclear weapon in the Middle East, China legally defines that action as essentially dropping a bomb directly on Beijing.
Under this newly constructed logic, any Chinese nuclear launch in response is strictly classified as a legitimate retaliation, a second strike.
It legally preserves their no-first-use policy by entirely redefining the boundaries of what constitutes an initial attack on the Chinese nation.
It is a profound piece of legal and strategic reframing.
In international relations, the actor who successfully defines the terms of the conflict often controls the battlefield.
By elevating a supply chain to the legal status of sovereign territory, the author creates the justification needed to alter global military posture.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting. A theory is just a theory until someone actually implements it. How does the author envision rolling out this roar of the wise doctrine on the ground?
The memo demands immediate, almost theatrical action. It calls for the supreme leadership to issue an emergency press conference today, March 9, to announce this doctrine to the world.
The core of the strategy is the public declaration of an uncrossable red line.
The author drafts a statement declaring that the moment any state uses a nuclear weapon in the Middle East, China will exercise the right to carry out immediate devastating retaliation against that state by all necessary military means.
To ensure this isn't perceived as an empty verbal threat, the memo details the strict mechanics of enforcement. The text specifies the immediate public utilization of China's constant real-time monitoring systems.
This involves tasking PLA satellite systems to detect infrared signals from missile launches, alongside activating global seismic wave and radioactive material dispersion monitors.
The strategic goal here is to publicly announce this surveillance network, sending a clear, undeniable message that China's eyes miss nothing.
And the moment a nuclear explosion is scientifically confirmed, the retaliatory protocol is automatic.
To physically back up that monitoring, the author demands that PLA Rocket Force ICBM units be immediately elevated to a heightened alert status.
The document equates this readiness level to a U.S. DEFCON Level 2.
For context, DEFCON 2 means armed forces are ready to deploy and engage in less than 6 hours. It is the step right before imminent nuclear war.
The author wants to make the threat of Chinese retaliation visible, undeniable, and impossible to walk back.
The author is also exceptionally careful to clarify the target of this massive umbrella of protection.
Yes, the memo explicitly states that China is not issuing this declaration to protect the Iranian regime.
In fact, it includes a very stern dual message aimed directly at Tehran. The memo clearly states that if Iran attempts to achieve nuclear armament during this crisis, or if they miraculously manage to use a nuclear weapon themselves,
they instantly lose all protection under the roar of the wise doctrine.
The moment they cross that line, Iran becomes a direct target for Chinese retaliation alongside anyone else.
The author is proposing a blanket quarantine of the entire region, enforcing absolute denuclearization, rather than forming a military alliance with one specific side.
This aggressive military posture is complemented by a series of immediate diplomatic flanking maneuvers.
The author proposes unofficially coordinating with Russia prior to the announcement.
The goal is to share the intent of the declaration and to signal readiness to vastly increase Russian overland and pipeline energy supplies to China.
This acts as an economic shock absorber, just in case the Strait of Hormuz is temporarily blockaded in the conventional fallout of the announcement.
They also outline a strategy for the United Nations, suggesting the immediate convening of an Emergency Security Council meeting to lead an international framework for Middle East denuclearization.
And on the domestic front, the author emphasizes a communication strategy aimed at the Chinese public,
clearly explaining that securing Middle Eastern oil is the absolute foundation of their daily livelihood.
They even suggest incorporating a specific quote from Foreign Minister Wang Yi into the messaging. The true value of military power lies in preventing war.
You can see the full spectrum approach at play here. Military readiness, legal justification, diplomatic maneuvering, and domestic public relations are all mobilized simultaneously.
The objective is to create an immovable deterrent wall.
This entire plan, however, seems to sidestep the most powerful actor in the region, the United States.
Oh, definitely.
The U.S. is deeply entrenched in the Middle East and acts as Israel's primary military and political ally. How does this doctrine account for the inevitable, massive American pushback to China, suddenly dictating the rules of engagement in their sphere of influence?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is perhaps the most strategic and, frankly, the most devious layer of the entire memorandum.
The author fully expects the U.S. to launch an all-out diplomatic and economic backlash.
Right. Denouncing the move as illegal Chinese hegemonic expansion and gross nuclear intimidation.
Yeah.
But rather than fighting that American force directly, the author proposes using the Taiji principle.
The Taiji principle, like the martial art Tai Chi, is all about using the opponent's own force, weight, and momentum against them. It is about redirecting energy rather than blocking it.
The author is targeting the fundamental structural vulnerability of the United States' nuclear umbrella.
The traditional Cold War logic of a nuclear umbrella is that a superpower will retaliate if its ally is attacked, thereby deterring the initial attack.
But the author points out that in this specific scenario, if Israel pulls the trigger first and initiates the Samson option, the traditional dynamic of the umbrella completely collapses.
The memo argues that if Israel strikes first, the United States has absolutely no rational strategic reason to risk its own homeland.
The author poses a chilling question. Would the U.S. leadership truly allow major urban centers like New York or Los Angeles to be turned to radioactive ash by Chinese ICBMs merely to defend an ally that just initiated a regional nuclear holocaust?
I want to pause on that because the substitution happening here is incredibly dark. The Roar of the Wise declaration forces the U.S. into an impossible, unwinnable dilemma.
The U.S. nuclear umbrella only functions as a defensive deterrent.
By drawing this uncrossable red line, China manipulates the board so that protecting Israel's use of a nuclear weapon guarantees the absolute destruction of the United States mainland.
Which leads to the ultimate geopolitical substitution. The only viable path for the United States to avoid its own destruction is to ensure that Israel never uses those weapons in the first place.
China's threat of retaliation against Israel essentially forces the United States to physically intervene and disarm its own ally.
The U.S. has to step in and stop the Samson option,
taking on all the political and military friction that entails, purely to avoid a global nuclear war with China. China achieves its ultimate goal of denuclearizing the Middle East and saving its oil supply by forcing the United States to do all the dirty work.
It is the ultimate jiu-jitsu move on the geopolitical stage. China doesn't lift a finger directly against the U.S. military or Israeli defense forces. It simply sets a tripwire that the United States is entirely too terrified to let anyone cross.
The ripple effects of this move, according to the memo, would completely reshape global allegiances,
effectively ending the era of unquestioned U.S. hegemony.
The author expects significant geopolitical fallout, largely accruing to China's long-term benefit.
They predict that the global south, countries like India, the ASEAN nations, and even traditionally pro-U.S. oil producers in the Middle East like Saudi Arabia and the UAE will offer tacit, quiet support to China's maneuver.
The logic there makes perfect sense based on the memo's framing, because China's red line isn't just protecting Chinese oil, it is protecting everyone's energy lifelines.
Those nations in the global south might not cheer loudly at the UN because they don't want to explicitly anger Washington, but inwardly, they would view China as the ultimate stabilizing factor.
The only adult in the room willing to enforce global survival.
Furthermore, the memo outlines how this doctrine would fundamentally neutralize regional tensions much closer to China's shores, specifically regarding Japan and Taiwan.
By successfully positioning China as the lone defender of human survival in global energy markets, any subsequent military posturing by the U.S. and Japan in the Taiwan Strait or the Southwest Islands is suddenly stripped of its moral high ground.
If China is widely perceived as having just saved the world from nuclear Armageddon in the Middle East, anyone trying to start a regional conflict over Taiwan looks like they are creating a dangerous, completely irresponsible distraction.
The memo actually twists the knife on Japan here, contrasting their current stance with a nostalgic mention of the lost ideals of former Japanese Prime Minister Hatoyama Yukio.
Hatoyama championed a vision for an East Asian community independent of U.S. dominance.
The author uses this to paint current Japanese politics as having sold out its historical mission for American protection.
The entire strategy, from the legal maneuvering to the Tai Chi manipulation of the U.S., culminates in a core philosophy. It is beautifully, if chillingly, summarized in the document by a quote from Sun Tzu's Art of War.
Supreme excellence is to subdue the enemy's army without fighting.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean? We have gone from the absolute terror of a ticking nuclear clock in a war-torn region to a masterclass in reading how superpowers view leverage, vulnerability, and the immense crushing weight of global interdependence.
We have seen how a theoretical military doctrine attempts to use the sheer mass of one nation's economic needs to essentially blackmail a rival superpower into enforcing global peace.
It is a profound look at the mechanics of deterrence and the lengths to which nations will theorize to protect their lifelines. And for you, the listener, whether you are managing a complex corporate team, critically reading the daily news, or studying international history, this document is a fascinating, extreme example of strategic framing.
It highlights a deeply transferable lesson on how radically redefining a concept like changing a reliance on imported oil into a core national interest equal to sovereign territory can legally and politically justify altering the fate of the entire globe.
It teaches us that in any conflict, the party that dictates the definitions often controls the outcome. It is all about how you frame the rules of the game.
This raises an important question, though, and it is something you should deeply ponder as we conclude our analysis today.
The entire Roar of the Wise doctrine, this elegant, Taiji-like manipulation of global military forces, relies entirely on a cold calculation.
It assumes absolute certainty that the United States, Israel, and Iran are perfectly rational actors who will weigh the costs and benefits exactly as the author predicts.
It assumes everyone will look at the geopolitical chessboard, recognize the trap, and make the logically sound move to avoid mutually assured destruction.
But in the chaotic, terrifying fog of an existential war, when nations feel their very survival is slipping away hour by hour, how much faith can any global strategy truly place in the assumption that desperate leaders will act completely rationally? When the clock is sitting at nuclear midnight, logic is very often the first casualty.